Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Mill Studio and our artist talk with Nick Bodimeade, talking about his Herd series of paintings. I first started working with Nick about 20 years ago when he had his first exhibition with me at the Zimmer Stewart Gallery in Arundel back in 2004. And so I've seen his work change and develop a lot over the years. But even prior to working with him, in the 20 years before that, I think Nick's work was largely abstract, so he's kind of veered towards representation, and now the conversation he's having with the audience, I suppose, is about representation and abstraction, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Julian Bell, who some of you may know as an author, described Nick's work as having an inability to produce art that is less than handsomely made. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I do remember that, but it's nice to be reminded of it because it's very kind.
Yes.
She is. Yeah, but it's also very nice to have that as a kind of thing to think about at the beginning because it reminds me to keep, when I'm talking to you about the paintings, to keep thinking about the fact that these things are made and the role of ideas and the role of planning and all that kind of stuff is it's in some way kind of secondary to the fact that these are manufactured objects, they're made objects, and there are things that happen in that making process that are really important, but also sometimes kind of hard to talk about. So I'm going to try and talk about the bits that are rather difficult to talk about. That's all right.
Well, and also the decisions that you have to make while a painting is ongoing. It's not just about mark making, and presumably things don't work out the way you think they're going to at the beginning, and you have to make decisions and change, and that changes the whole structure of the painting and the way we end up looking at your work.
Very much so. And there's a kind of lovely idea, or a lovely sort of justification for the kind of things that people do in art school, which is the idea that working with resistant materials is incredibly important, because basically with a resistant material you have an idea and then you have this piece of material and you apply this idea to this piece of material and it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. It's transformed by the material and your interactions with it in ways which are so complex that you couldn't have preconceptualized them. So that's interesting. That's the magic of making objects, and painting for me in particular, is that it doesn't do what you thought it was going to do, and in that process, new ideas come up, potentially completely new ways of thinking about your subject matter and thinking about the way you approach the making of the object as well.
Yeah. Our first exhibition, which I remember well because it was one of the first exhibitions I had, was called Dogs, Trucks and Sheds. But it wasn't until 2006 when you started looking at the beach paintings, where you had kind of the larger figures. And then following that, the exhibition we had with you in 2008 was the first time. Well, the exhibition was called Beach Geometry, and it was the first time you brought in the idea of people in personal space, which leads into these cow paintings that we have here, this one and these ones, where we talk about herd instinct in a way, the way people and groups join together and separate from each other and form clumps. So is there something that brought you onto that idea, or was it just working with the photographic source material that you start off with that led you into that way of representing it on the canvas?
Okay, that's
deep.
It's a nice question. But I think that I'm going to go backwards a little bit. And you talked about the sheds, dogs and trucks.
Yes.
And the title of that. And I particularly like the language of that. So shed, dog, truck, they all got four.
Well, sheds technically 5.
All right, anyway. Hey, whatever. But then they're almost, almost onomatopoeic. And Chris, you can remember we were talking about onomatopoeia on stage about. And I like the idea of a painting, painting of a dog, and the word dog seems to also somehow sum up the idea of how that might feel, and a truck and a shed. So there's something to do with the language, wordy language, and then trying to find an equivalent directness in the pictorial language. So this is a painting of a truck, and it's painted like a truck, and this dog is painted like a dog in some way.
Well, and also in those, the subject filled the canvas.
Yeah.
I mean, you were making a statement, dog, truck, shed, because it was a shed that filled the page.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when we come to beach geometry, then I'm trying to, in that title, trying to have two ideas. One is the idea of the beach, and the other one is the idea of composition and organisation, and that there's a kind of system. So that this thing that looks initially, because they were based on photographs of Bondi Beach, and so initially it looks like a fairly kind of random organisation of hundreds of people on this beach, until you start looking, and then you start seeing the way people organise themselves on the beach in relation to personal space, in relation to where the sun, the wind is, backs to the pavilion, and there's all sorts of kind of systems that are at play within the kind of spatial organisation of the beach. And then you've got another set of organisational principles in there, which are the ones to do with painting itself, and then ideas to do with how the painting relates to the age, how the eye will move around the surface of the painting, how paintings tend to have a frame within a frame to stop the eye from going off on the edge. All of those kinds of pictorial structures that are part of painting are there in parallel with the kind of organisational structures that they're on the beach. So, yeah, so in that there is a kind of relationship between formal aspects of painting, kind of abstract qualities of painting, and trying to find a subject that interacts with those formal aspects of abstract painting, or formal and abstract values that exist in almost every kind of decent painting, I think. Yeah. And then later on, having worked with the beaches, I had gone to Bondi and then gone to New Zealand, then these images, back in the day, I became interested in the way that the Herd paintings also had some of that, had a potential to talk about that relationship between the organisation that exists in the subject and the organisation of pictorial structures.
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. Since then, of course, you've kind of veered away from people and cows and things like that, and you've also looked at cityscapes. For example, Seville. There was a whole series of wonderful Seville paintings, almost taken from a drone footage, where we were looking down at these buildings all closely knit together. And the structure of those seem to be, have the same kind of visual language that you do with the people. Yeah. Other paintings, such as the Southern USA woodlands and various other ones, kind of changed a bit. And then, more recently, you've been doing your B-row paintings, which has these wonderful, there's none here, but the beautiful kind of big strokes, like with these kind of larger cow paintings, allow you a bit more freedom and also develop the abstract nature of the paintings.
There's a thing in all of these, and it's to do with the kind of interplay between things that are flat and things that are spatial. And so in something like this painting here, there is a kind of grid-like woven structure, which is very kind of clearly painted on the surface of a flat object, and flattens the space, but at the same time as that, then you've got multiple piercings of that space where you are then invited to look deep within it. And so the painting is I suppose is all about that relationship between a surface and stressing that surface, and at the same time as that creating the illusion of a space going back into deep space beyond the surface of the canvas. And with the cattle, it's a much shallower space. With the Bondi Beach paintings, it's the height of the tallest person on the ground kind of a space. But there's also a kind of tipped back space in these as well. So there's they have a relationship with paintings I was really interested in as a student and continue to be interested in, which is Monet's water lilies. If you know Monet's water lilies, they're extraordinary things in that they have a flat surface and lots of really interesting kind of gestural marks going around on top of that surface. And then in the subject matter, of course, you've got the lake, and you've got the lake, which is a plane that tips back into space, and then you've got things that sit on the surface of that water, on the surface of the lake, and then you've got things that exist underneath the surface of that, and then you've got stuff on there which is a reflection of stuff that's up in the sky. So, and then you've got, quite often at the front edge of the painting, you've got willow leaves which hang down on the surface of the front edge of the painting, which of course are right at the foreground. And so the number of ways in which he is painting different kinds of deep spaces or illusionary spaces, just astonishing. And I think those paintings, to me anyway, are the paintings that do all the kind of groundwork for later abstract painting in terms of thinking about figure-ground relationship and space in painting. You know, big differences between that and the conventional pictorial space of perspectival space, or where you've got foreground, middle ground, distance, sky, all that kind of stuff. Changed all of that, enabled us to then have Jackson Pollock's kind of space, Howard Hodgson's kind of space. Anyway, so
well
brings us, I think, slightly
back to these, because they're all on a slope, which allows you in your painting and the compositions to have these kind of lovely long shadows, and also the way that the cows are positioned on the slope, they're always kind of, well, seemingly sideways on, which gives you a nice kind of grid of cows on the painting, and it's visually pleasing rather than having the more kind of higgledy-piggledy. But you don't put in a horizon, so it's only the light that gives us the indication of the steepness, if you like, of the slope.
When we were talking about those kind of Monets and the interactions of all of those different kinds of ways in which he was thinking about space, the different spatial elements of the painting. In these ones, there's a fascinating set of ingredients there. So you've got the slope, and it's a volcanic New Zealand field. So kind of soft and granular, got grass on it, but it's easily worn away, a bit like the side of the Downs. So you've then got the fact that the cattle will traverse it backwards and forwards, and they create ridges that go backwards and forwards over the slope. Then you've got the fact that how do cattle behave on the slope? But they don't tend to go up and down it. They traverse it. Their bodies are much better than at doing that. So they're tending mostly to be running parallel with the lines, the traverse lines on the slope. Then you've got the sunlight, and the sunlight is then coming down, and it's picking up the topography and casting horizontal lines on it, and at the same time as then throwing shadows which are a kind of an elongation, an abstraction and simplification of the shape of the cows. But those shapes of the cows, as the shadows always do, they talk about the ground as well. So that's the wonderful thing about a shadow is it both is connected to the object that's casting the shadow, and it provides a kind of secondary information on that object, but it's also deformed by the terrain on which the shadow casts. So it's giving us more information about really kind of rich in terms of thinking about made me want to think about figure-ground relationship, how objects and the space in which they exist can be, how they interact, how they're connected. So there's also in here the idea of a cow's personal space. And, you know, they organise themselves in particular kinds of ways. And I remember years ago looking at a student's work, and the student had been painting swans on a river. And they effectively had kind of collaged a bunch of swans together on a river, and it just looked wrong. And I couldn't work out what it was, but in the end it worked out that she wasn't obeying the rules of Swan's ideas of personal space, nor was there any sense of a current. And it was a river. So we looked at the original photograph that she'd been working on, and clearly that was, all of that information was in there.
Yeah.
You know, information to do with light, current, swan space, all that kind of stuff. So I'm really interested in this idea of there being a range of different systems that are at play in the subject. And then there being a kind of a parallel for those systems in the painting. But perhaps we'll come to that.
Yeah. But also, you're creating a painting which, for yourself and for others, is not just about representation of the sun, the topography, the herd space. You would like to kind of move more into abstraction to perhaps obscure that. So you just give people an indication of the subject that you're painting, and thereby they have some pleasure in determining and having that, recognising within the patterns what the painting is about.
Yes, and I think there's something else in that as well, which is that while I'm making paintings, I'm also consciously in dialogue with other painters and ideas about painting. And recently in my teaching, I've been showing slides of early Mondrian paintings, Mondrian's landscape paintings. And he paints a lot of cows. And in looking at these Mondrian cow paintings, I was thinking about there's a classic idea about, a classic explanation for the development of Mondrian's painting, an abstract painting as well, which he looks at a tree. And he starts painting the tree relatively representationally, and then slowly the tree becomes more and more abstracted until it becomes about a series of intersections, and we end up with that kind of grid-like structure of Mondrian's painting. But look it up on the net. There is a kind of evolutionary approach to thinking about how he got there. And I was looking at these cow paintings of Mondrian's. I thought they were actually much better than these tree paintings. And I think a much more interesting way of thinking about how he started this process of abstraction. So the cows, and they were nearly always Frisians, so they were cows which were broken up by their black and white blobbiness, and they were kind of rectangular. Cows are rectangular. So you get 2 or 3 cows together, you've got a grid system. And then you've got the grid system being black and white. So, this will do. So you've got something that looks a little bit like this, which looks like a Mondrian. And I suppose that looks a bit like but it struck a chord with me because years ago when I've been painting these grid paintings, I thought I'm painting wobbly Mondrians. And that was before I even knew that Mondrian had painted cows. So that my interest in these cow paintings was kind of revived by looking at through the teaching and looking at these fantastic. Look at them! Look them up. They're lovely. These Mondrian landscape, early Mondrian landscape paintings.
Yeah. Well, there is of course the Tate exhibition that's on at the moment, which does include some of his early landscape paintings. But I've had a look and I didn't think that there was any of the cow ones, unfortunately.
I don't think there are.
Which is very sad.
Hard to find.
Yeah. They do exist from this kind of 1902 to 1910 period, but but it's still worthwhile going to that exhibition, I think, which is on at Tate Modern right now. So just coming back to your paintings, there's clearly in here there's kind of 2 streams of work. We have these fairly exact herd paintings of cows on the hillside, where your paint strokes need to be quite well placed in order for the whole painting to work. And then we have these more kind of loose paintings where with kind of veering to more abstraction with broad, luscious kind of brush strokes. But the two do relate to each other.
Yeah, and they do, but I think there is one of the things that I make paintings, and I use a range of different approaches to making paintings, and then there's the subject matter of the paintings, and it looks as if my interest is mostly in trees and cows, whereas I think what my real interest is in painting and how the world can be turned into paintings, if that makes sense. So it's not, some people, they might be really fascinated in dogs, but that doesn't necessarily make for a good painting. So you've got to be really interested in paintings to make a good dog painting. So the primary study of painters, I think, really is into painting. So where am I going with this? So I think there is a kind of range of different approaches to the making of painting. So some which is more kind of analytical and measured and has that kind of geometrical kind of quality to it, and others which are closer to abstract expressionism. They're closer to a kind of gestural, expressive way of making marks. And I move between these two poles, and that's I suppose that's just a kind of indicator of my interest, and I'm actually testing the boundaries of that and trying to bring them together and pushing them apart and so forth. So it's interesting. So the two poles exist in these two big Windblow paintings. So in this one, even though it's pretty gestural and pretty juicily handled, it's quite a kind of carefully constructed painting where marks are accurately placed within it to create the kind of the illusionary three-dimensional space and the sense of there being not exactly a consistent light source, but certainly there being a light source. Whereas in this painting over here, the paint is applied in a much more kind of fluid manner. The material nature of the paint, where sometimes it's scraped off, sometimes it's dribbled on, sometimes it's dissolved, all of that, I think, is what gives this painting its power, is that sense of it being like the material of the forest. It's dank and it's fetid, and it probably is a bit slimy in places and smelly and that kind of stuff. And it's got a kind of weird light, and so the material nature of the paint and how it's handled in that one gives a reading which is much more, I think, much more heart-based or gut-based. Whereas in this one, it's slightly kind of cooler, slightly more analytical, perhaps slightly more carefully constructed, painting about the idea of this kind of weave, this mesh and a space through it. And I think we've got those kind of more exaggeratedly, those kind of poles in the kind of gestural paintings, which are, I think, about what do cows feel like? Cows lying in nitrogen-rich grass, because they're sated, they've had their fill, and it's a warm, sunny day. They're just gorgeous, and you want to stroke them and sort of lie down and put your head on their tummies. And, there's that kind of a thing going on there. I'm trying that, for me, in those paintings is more important than the anatomy of a cow. It's that kind of sense.
Just staying with these two Windblow paintings for a second. So this one, for me, is much more kind of three-dimensional. You feel like you can actually carefully work your way through it. You can see the light through the trees on the other side. This one is less so, but you seem to have got the dribbling, if you like. I don't know if there's a technical term for it, the dribbling of some form of paint on there. Is that you perhaps bringing in what you were mentioning about Monet's water lilies with the willow at the front to give you an element of 3 dimensions that you're looking through something to get to the subject beyond.
Yeah, it does that, and I think there are special devices in that painting, like the dribbles, and obviously a dribble, it's like water running down a window pane. It tells you where the window pane is, and a dribble running down the surface of a canvas tells you what the flat plane of the canvas is, and then it allows a kind of illusionary space behind it. And then I do a very nice lecture all about dribbles in painting, because they occur so often, particularly in contemporary painting. It's become a cliche in a way, but it's very useful because it does stress the front of the painting, the picture plane. But then there are also areas where I've taken a silicone rubber kitchen spoon and gouged the wet paint out. And so you've got skin of wet paint and I've cut a hole in it. And that again stresses the surface of the painting. And you get this weird thing, you get a kind of thing that looks like it's painted and it's got illusionary space, and then you cut a hole in it, and it goes back to layers of the painting underneath, and then maybe a mark gets put in on top of that. So there's a way in which you've got as in this one, the illusionary space of the painting, things going on top of each other. In this one, you've also got a kind of a space which actually has to do with the mechanics of the production of the painting. This sits on top of this has been gouged through this dribbles through this and dissolves this. And so there are a kind of set of things that if the painting didn't have any representational space in it at all, you would still have space because of the way those practical manufacturing elements would work.
Yeah. So seemingly these two paintings are quite similar, but in fact you've come to paint them in quite different ways.
And that keeps happening in what I do, and I'm not sure. No, I don't know. I think going into the studio is about exploring this stuff, and then if I end up with a painting that comes out of that process that I think is interesting, then it makes it into an exhibition. But it might come out of, I don't know what's going to come out necessarily. And I suppose I go with an approach in mind, but it may or may not work. So it's a testing process.
Yeah. Well, I think we've talked for quite a bit for now, so I don't know if there's any questions from the floor, if anyone has any questions on what you've heard or from looking at the paintings.
Thanks for the talk, it's really interesting. I just would like to comment on these two paintings, that they're split into two canvases, and was that consciously done, that there's no gap in between, they're totally buffed up as one structure.
Really interesting question. That one has been also exhibited with a gap between the two paintings of exactly that distance of the depth of the structure, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. Which is better? It's very, very different. The reason for painting in two bits is so I can transport them and move them around the studio, but also that when I'm painting the paintings, and there is a group of about 6 or 7 of these now, it means I can paint them that way, and then I can do that, and then I can paint them a little bit in that way, and then I can do that. So what I can do is I can use the fact that it's a diptych to keep disrupting the kind of normal ways in which you might make a painting if it was one big painting. So and I've done that over the years many times, kind of use that ability of diptychs to get to or even take it, these ones you can't do it with, but you're taking a bit from one painting and trying it out as the other side of another painting. Because we do things in a very predictable way if we're not careful. So a lot of studio time is spent trying to challenge the ordinary ways we do things. Yeah?
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
But it also becomes quite a sort of visual ingredient within the work, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That,
I think, yes, and again flattens the space.
yes, so it kind of reminds us again, we look at a painting that's made out of canvas and stretched from this and
Correct.
canvas, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's where also that, if there is a gap and the wall comes through it, it's extremely disruptive of the illusionary space. And the eye keeps jumping backwards and forwards over it. So in terms of what the work that the viewer has to do, it's not just like looking through a window anymore, you know, or it's like looking out of that window, looking out of that window, and imagining what's going on between the two windows. So it's intriguing, but I haven't got a don't know where it's going yet.
Any? Yeah. Well, sounds a silly question really, but do these cows have tails? I just kind of wondered.
There is one on that one.
I can see one here. Yes. Generally speaking, there's a lot of cows.
To a large extent, I kind of ignore them.
Right.
And it's partly because, I mean, they will often have a squared off back end, which is what the tail is doing, because the tail is kind of operating like a kind of plumb line in a way. So yeah, so I'm not painting them in because they would be too small as a component within the painting. But the verticality of a plumb tail is very often in there.
Yeah.
So that's what and sometimes they don't have legs either. Because
I was going to come on to that. Yeah. So, your beach geometry series, we've got one of those.
Yeah.
And, there's like bits of arms and legs missing, is it?
Yes.
And people always come in and talk about that.
Yeah.
But
And there is
you haven't done that here.
Well, there are bits missing. There are bits missing from them, and I think, and so this is a couple of things here. There's a classic thing that if you're an artist and you're used to kind of doing drawing and doing life drawing, and you're drawing, and here's the hip, and here's the shoulder, and here's the leg, and here's the face. So there's that kind of shift in gear, which may or may not be desired. You might want the face suddenly to cramp up and become incredibly kind of tight and awkward. But if you're not careful, you do that because suddenly you start worrying about the face, and you say, "Oh, you've got eyes and they've got a wrinkle here." Well, you weren't worried about that down here. So it's trying to be consistent in the looking in some way. But there's a thing that happens if you work with a particular scale of mark, which is so I'm trying to create this kind of matrix of marks, and that's almost more important than the representation. If I change the mark because I've got to put a tail in, then that's what you'll see. You'll a bit like looking at that kind of where things tighten up on the face of a life drawing. That's where the eye will go into that bit where there was a gear change. And so a lot of painters try and find ways of making sure that doesn't happen. They have a kind of particular rhythm to the way in which they paint. And in the beach paintings you're referring to, at one point I found that you can have a metronome on your phone, and I would set my phone metronome up, and I would paint at the rhythm of the metronome, so that I couldn't get to the edge of somebody's body and start painting in the arm, because I didn't have time. I had to keep going at that particular kind of rate. And so that's a kind of process-based way of thinking about painting, which has a huge impact on a painting. And it also brings me to another interest I have, which is process-based abstraction, which is where the artist has an approach to making the painting which they predetermine. Then they carry out that kind of instruction to self, make a painting, without making aesthetic interventions along the way. They're following their own instructions, and then at the end of the process they say, "Oh, that works, but I think that bit needs dealing with." So they then go back into that, they make another painting with revised instructions. So it's a really it's really interesting way, for me, I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about the production of paintings, and it's, again, part of what I do. I'm very interested in the idea of kind of instructions to self, which will stop me from, which will challenge my way of producing and what it is that I produce. That I won't be changing pace within the painting because I'm being kind of sucked down a particular direction because it looks more interesting. Or it's a anyway. So yes, weird one. Went a long way away from the cows.
Yeah,
but
well, it's kind of about knowing when a painting is finished, isn't it? And when there's enough information and marks to indicate what you want to portray without going too far down that road.
And also it is interesting also that idea, when is the painting finished? The painting could be finished because you have made, you were going to make a painting out of 478 marks with a 2-inch brush. That's a really good instruction to self. And when you've made 478 marks out of a 2-inch brush, you stop. It's good. And then if it's a bit rubbish, then you make another one and you make it better. Same instruction. Anyway, Simon.
Do you think, I've got a million questions, but following on from that, do you think that setting out some of those goals, like 400 non-strokes with a 2-inch brush, do you think that's a good way to start teaching people to sort of almost lose their inhibitions? And I'll sort of connect that through to something you said very early on about the resistance and feeling the resistance. And I'm guessing you mean the consistency of the paint, the texture of the canvas, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And because I've got a tiny bit of experience trying to teach kids how to draw. And the one thing they're afraid of is just the stuff. You'd think they'd want to go crazy with it, but actually they're so conscientious about, well, it's not conscientious, it's so concerned about doing it correctly.
I think, I mean, in my teaching, I do some things which I always think are useful. One of them is I get students to draw horizontal lines in different ways, but horizontal lines where the gap between the lines is the same thickness as the line itself, if you can. So it's an instruction. It's a bit like 428 marks, whatever it is. So what you're doing is you're doing that. And in this case, you're not even thinking about the subject matter. You're just drawing these lines and trying to keep that gap the same. So by the end of half an hour later, you produce the most extraordinary landscape. And it's suddenly, because it shifts and it changes, and each mark changes the mark. They become enormously complex. They're full of light, they're full of kind of energy, they're full of a sense of the body that made the drawing. The complexity from the simple instruction is enormous. And I think, and it's not scary.
Yeah.
But and then at the end of it, you look at it and you start thinking about what is it have I done? What are these interacting systems that have produced this thing, which looks completely gorgeous? So as a So I suppose my answer to that is that for me it's a big part of teaching. Is that because sometimes we have this idea, this thing that we want to produce, and much better to think about our means of production, make something, critique it, and then make something else in response to that. Because what that's then doing is it's putting the kind of stress on the making, and then the critical evaluation of what's been made, and then the making in response to the critical evaluation. Whereas otherwise we make this thing, and it doesn't fit what we wanted to make, and we just beat ourselves up about it. And then we try and make something that's a bit more like, it's the wrong way around, it seems to me. We make something that's gorgeous, and then we try and make something that's even more gorgeous and build on that. Is that reasonably?
I just listen to you talk about this.
I know that's quite fascinating, isn't it? Hearing about this
the whole
process.
resistance thing I find fascinating because that seems to be at the core of
So,
every craft thing.
yeah. So that thing of go back to that drawing. So one of the instructions might be that this line starts, this piece of paper, it starts there, but it goes there. So as it goes there, your arm will not get heavy. And as you come down, your arm also starts having a radius to it. Because you can't really draw, well, you can just, but it's really awkward to draw a parallel. So there's a whole bunch of things that start to happen in that, which are in themselves beautiful because they're nature. They're like waves breaking on the shore, or like how a tree grows, or all of those kinds of things are coming out, rather than us torturing the material into in accordance with our will.
Going on from that, do you overturn the canvas round to paint?
Yeah.
You do, okay.
Yeah, and so
these have all got a left,
well,
upper right, lower left side.
that's right, because we have a tendency to do that. So if you turn your canvas around, then there's little things like the fact that if you do that mostly in a painting, then these are death marks, aren't they? Sliding towards the grave. Do that, and it's about life, and it's about vitality. But it's true, isn't it?
Mm.
That as an action is so different from that as an action. I'm dragging things down. I'm raising things up.
Fascinating.
Can I mean, like Simon, I've got a million things that I'd like to ask or to say, but can I kind of want to provoke you to say something, Nick, about the difference of the quality of the visual process of looking that's articulated between those three Herd paintings that are around you.
Yeah.
There's a really fantastic shift in the way that you manage to capture the feel of looking at a herd of cows on a hillside, in sun, in the distance, but it changes between the three.
Mm. And it's weird, and it is to do with at what stage in this case, at what stage in the process of the painting that I decided to stop painting it. And in fact, in each case, partly it's been about stopping at a certain point. So that's the one that's been taken to the most extreme and logical conclusion. This one was a painting that was stopped very early, but it was also stopped early because I remember another painting which I hadn't stopped early that reminded me of the paintings of cattle on the walls at Lascaux, the cave paintings at Lascaux, which I suddenly found like there was I, kind of using my telephone photo lenses, my gridding up and my projection and all this kind of technology, making an image that suddenly reminded me of these images that go right back to the first images we ever made. The drawing mark in this one seemed to be on a lumpy surface, which looked a little bit like Lascaux. Anyway, I'm not trying to make too much of it, but it was one of the reasons I wanted to stop, because for me it's kind of that process of coming into being within this, where it was shifting from the drawn mark to the painted mark, felt interesting. In these ones, also that the paintings were about trying to find a way of making a painting where I was effectively drawing with a brush, and therefore saying it goes like this, and it goes like this, and it goes like this, and then it goes like this. So that there is that kind of directionality. It's a different kind of directionality to that, but it's the kind of like the directionality you might get in a pencil drawing, where you're using kind of repeat marks to move the eye and then stop the eye and then move it again. And so that one is very much what's going on with it. And then in this one, it's this kind of combination of kind of blobbing and that drawn mark. And so the blobbing goes on in these, but in this one it's more kind of extreme, that kind of relationship between blobbed marks and then this very kind of angular one. And there had been initially a plan that I was going to take the angular mark all the way across the painting, but But then I thought, well, maybe I'll do it, instead of having a kind of sense on the border, I'll do a bit here, I'll do a bit there, and then see at what point I want to stop. And maybe I won't stop. But it seemed to work. It seemed to want to stop at this point. And then Matt, my brother, was in here and saying, he really wants to lie down there. He wanted to lie down there and have a snooze. Not there, because it's too steep. Yeah, you roll down the hill, but and he was absolutely right. The painting has a space that does that. And so that is a slightly less steep bit of terrain, probably because of the way the shape works, and there's a kind of elliptical space within there. But anyway, that void space is kind of critical was the map, and I think he's right, critical to the way the painting works and where you project yourself into it, in amongst the cattle. Okay.
Any more questions? Oh yeah, there you go.
So does I know that you draw as you're preparing for a painting and thinking about the composition.
Not always, but
okay.
but anyway, quite often, yeah.
So when you're making these discoveries as you're painting, how often does your the composition change because of what you're discovering in the painting?
It varies. I'm doing a lot of work on a computer beforehand, so I'm kind of sizing the image. I'm sliding around what I think is going to happen at the edges, and then the edges are a kind of critical bit for these because they're how I'm fairly convinced that what happens in a painting is that your eye goes to the edge. It goes to the edge of most things, So looking at me, the middle bit of me is not much use, doesn't contain very much information. But the edge of me contains a lot of information, and it differentiates me from the wall and from the chair and so on and so forth. So on a painting, the eye will go to the edge of the painting, and it will go around and around and around the edge until it's invited in. And then once it's invited in by a mark, then it will go off and it will take a journey, and then it'll go around the edge again, and then it will pop back in again. And so there is a kind of the edge is a part of that. So in the planning for the painting, I'm trying to think about what's going to be happening at the edges, and they're probably the bit that I'm thinking about at the beginning of the painting, but also the bit that I'm doing the most work on later on at the end of the painting, because they're key to how the eye travels around it. And for me, that's dead important. I mean, you really don't want something where the eye goes, oh. She does so often. You make a painting where the eye just leaves the painting and doesn't continue on a kind of fruitful route around it. So trying to, so the diagrammatic drawing, and when I do make drawings for a painting, they are diagrams rather than anything else. Usually with a felt tip pen, usually very small, because they're trying to understand big simple structures about how the painting's going to work. I mean, I think that painting there is a kind of nice example of a kind of a blocky structure, but it's all about the edge of the painting and how those forms come in from that edge. I mean, it really is like just a kind of grid painting, isn't it?
Would you ever paint a bigger painting and then say, right, I've done this 4 foot square painting, and I want a 2 foot square picture, and just move something around until it feels right, and then trim it accordingly?
No. I have in the past.
Yeah.
I have in the past, and I will do it, and I'll do that with preparatory drawings.
Right.
But I won't tend to do that with the painting. I will try and make the painting work as an object, as a composed object. And I think it's partly to do with that edge quality. If you crop something, it looks like it's been cropped. And I think I tend to work on very particular stretches, and they've got a radius to the edge of them, some people work on very sharp edge stretchers, but I like to work on a stretcher which has a rounded edge because of the way in which it's finished at a certain point. It's a bit like a difference between kind of sawing a piece of wood up with a circular saw and calling that a tabletop, and then actually having a tabletop that finishes at a round or a beveled edge. It's, I want the painting to have a kind of object quality and an edge quality, which cropping it would lose that both optically and materially.
With the eye moving around the paintings, occasionally some artists put in a device or something to actually just stop the eye and create a focus, and I think you have done that in the past sometimes, but with these ones, you want the eye just to continue moving around as it does.
Yeah, I'm picking things up along the way, but and I suppose that going back to the kind of Monet water lilies and the other kind of early influence, which was Jackson Pollock's painting, I just thought this stuff was fantastic because it was a way of being able to paint all over the surface of the painting, and there not to be that kind of hierarchy within it, particularly. I mean, yes, the paintings do have points where they stop. There are points where it's a bit like having a full stop or a dot in a painting. It tends to there are these points where the eye slows down and stops while it lingers.
And you know how you said you these were different versions, or not versions, these were different stages within the painting process. Are you debating with yourself when to stop at any point?
Yeah.
And is it you on, am I being overindulgent? You know what I mean? What is your, it's obviously a feeling. Can you express it, or is it just a debate?
I think it's so much of it is about just testing. And sometimes you stop, and then you come back in the studio a couple of days later, well, that was, I need to continue, that wasn't a good. So I try lots of different ways of thinking about when a painting stops. So I wasn't really joking also about this idea of 2,000 marks or 200 marks or 400 marks. I have made paintings where, particularly with the beach paintings, where the kind of pixelated marks, once the surface of the painting is covered, that's the end of the painting. There might be some very minor adjustments, but it was very much about covering the surface of the painting, painting in negative spaces. So there isn't. I absolutely don't have a way of doing it, and I think that's going back to where we were starting, which is that I'm interested in all of those possible ways of doing it, and thinking, what happens if I apply that some terrible thief in terms of other people's working processes? Because I will want to kind of see what happens if I take a Richard Diebenkorn and I'll look at him and I'll try and make a painting that kind of robs him blind. but clearly, Howard Hodgkin is somebody I use a lot as a kind of weird kind of influence.
No, to me it's not really, are you trying to control your own indulgence? Like it's like a passion, you know what I mean? Or, do you know what I mean?
It's a weird one.
Because mentally,
Because indulgence, it almost sounds as if I really like being in the studio. And I do a bit really like being in the studio, but I find painting terrifically hard. And so it's not a great pleasure.
Chris?
I was dying to ask earlier when you talked about all the preparatory work that you do on the computer, and I thought, no, this is something I need to ask you afterwards, but now I want to ask it from what you just said. Where do you do the work on the computer physically?
In the studio.
It is in the studio.
In the studio. And we haven't talked about this at all. So I work from photographs. It's weird, I haven't talked about it.
There's a lot we haven't talked about.
But I
We'll
work
have to have a part two.
Yeah, I work in photographs, and I was an abstract painter for the early part of my career, such as it is, and one of the reasons why I was an abstract painter was because the kinds of things I wanted to paint weren't available. I'm not interested in being a plein air painter. I didn't want to go outside in the rain and make pictures. And photography, black and white photography, and all that as a means of gathering information seemed appalling. So I was an abstract painter because I had all I needed in the studio to work with in a way, and I could look out the window, I could go for a walk indoors, bring that information back. But then we had the advent of digital photography, and suddenly that one could have thousands of images in the studio, and then we had laptops and computers and projection and all of this kind of stuff. So the ability to work with photographic imagery just became so much more exciting. The other thing that happened at that time as well with computers was the ability to take a photograph, bring it back, look at it, and zoom in and crop and zoom in and crop and change the photograph, so that there was a process of exploration of the image going on in the studio rather than I'm painting this photograph. The photograph was infinitely manipulable, even to the point I want to change the colour. I'll put it. So doing all of that stuff meant that painting could be was an exploration of images as well as of the subject, and that was really exciting. It really kind of made me interested in being a representational painter, interested in painting, interested in photography, interested in image making, but interested in how all of that stuff works with the subject matter chosen for how it interacts with that much bigger bunch of stuff to do with photography and painting and image manipulation and art history and all of that stuff.
It's interesting you mentioned Howard Hodgkin, because we would all look at his paintings and think that they were just pure abstract, but he always described himself as a figurative painter. You know, every painting or image that he produced represented something, you know, a landscape, a building, a tea party, I think, in one case. And you're coming at it from the other way. You're producing these representational works, veering on the abstraction or with the abstract elements. And that might be a good place to stop, given that we've been going for about an hour.
I'm sorry.
So is that all right if we stop now, unless there's any more kind of pressing questions?
I just wonder, is there a video of you painting with a metronome?
I think if not,
So I'd love to see it.
I did it for quite a while. It drove me completely nuts. It was really horrible.
Well, it just leaves me to say to Nick, thank you very much for spending this hour with us, because I think it was very useful, very informative for me, and hopefully for other people here. So thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.